very much to all our participants. I'm going to open the discussion to the floor now. I'm sure that after a few rounds of conversation, some of you have questions or comments that you'd like to make, or provocations.
Am I allowed to address a question to McKenna? I'd like to take...
I'm the least skilled here, so...
I think you won't be able to answer the question that I'm going to ask though. Pulling off of the Mars idea, if you had to now design an African city on Mars, a Cape Town, what are the elements, and you have to take some, that you would take, and what are the elements that you would leave behind? Let's say 3 of each.
What a difficult
I'm going to take 2 more questions and then I'm going to open it up to the panel.
Hi, Jodie Alameda from Urban Econ Development Economist. More of a challenge perhaps to members and audience than a question or a comment. I'd like to suggest that VPUU has become so popular because it prefigures future worlds that some of us would like to imagine becoming a reality in a broad environment. So really I'd like to challenge all of us sitting here to, in our own lives, try to prefigure that same future city. I'm focused on words like love. So what does that mean? It means loving everybody in the city, not just their needs, but also the contributions that they can make, which might mean things like hosting these events in other areas to actually love the contributions of other people, other members of our society. A city that is loved by everybody, so there we're talking about all visitors, getting over xenophobia and things like that. How do we design a city for people with many differences? I think a lot of the sort of things about this sort of spatial inequality and spatial divide in the city, a lot of that, if you look at the ordinary lives of people, is fluid. We do live across these boundaries. There is quite an artificial divide between town and township, unreal Cape Town, real Cape Town, unreal Africa, real Africa. And I think we'd like to challenge people to try and step across that in our own lives. I like that the word capitalism was raised. I think that we imagine that we have a set of options and that those options are our only options, and that speaks to the idea of a brief, and then we will only recreate what is already familiar to us. So if we can each in our individual lives step outside of those options, if we want to see economies that are supporting certain types of local industries, we should in our own consumer choices be supporting those. Otherwise we will contribute to repeating the familiar mistakes of the past.
My name is Andrew, by the way, and I just wanted to ask people, we've heard a lot of interesting words, once again, capitalism, but talking about the idea of the African city as well. And a lot of times people speak about Cape Town, and I hear this particularly from people who come to visit, saying this isn't an African city, and residents as well love to talk about the fact that this isn't really an African city. And funny enough, this week through things like Infecting the City, we had a beautiful performance from the Cape Philharmonic at Church Square one night, where we had beautiful buildings lit up and it was spectacular. The next day you go to Langa, where there was recently a fire that rendered 1,500 people homeless. It's literally just over the mountain, and I think a lot of times we come to a problem where a lot of the residents in the city, especially given the choice of making massive changes to the economy or massive changes to structure, would say, well, but we're happy as we are. So what's in it for us, and why should we actually think about changing our city? And with a bunch of architects sitting here, I wanted to know what architecture could do in the form of producing solutions that are, within the, short of changing the whole idea of the capitalist economy, that would be palatable for people to say, oh, but it's actually not that bad to think about social housing within the central city. That is social housing that looks good, that is functional, that integrates well, and showing that people that these challenges that we're all talking about are imperative to actually not just approach within the existing townships, but must also be approached within the central city.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask our panelists to respond, starting with Morgana, and then the questions around capitalism, I'll open it to the rest of the floor to whoever wants to respond.
That's a very tough question. A couple of things came to mind as you asked. I mean, the first thing is I recalled an excerpt from a particular essay that I read where the Corbusier, when he was so fascinated with concrete, he actually started proposing to people that we should actually take concrete to the moon, And he was actually ridiculed by scientists saying, this ridiculous architect does how heavy it is to take concrete to the moon. That's the last thing we want to take. So that's the first thing about taking objects to a different location. The second thing is this issue of how do people adapt to different environments. If you look from an evolutionary perspective, it's quite interesting. If you look at the Western Cape as the cradle of mankind, and hominids going into very different environments, whether it's desert or Antarctic environments, they actually took very little with them. I think what they took with them was a very particular attitude about a respect to landscape, and being able to adapt to different conditions. The ability to work cooperatively in order to solve problems, and the ability to actually leave preconceptions behind. So if I was to create an African city in Mars, I don't think I would objectify it into beadwork or this or that. I would say that I would take an attitude that says, what is the landscape of that particular area and how does one respect it? Second thing, I would say that it's such a harsh environment that it requires collaborative action to survive here. So how do I inculcate an attitude of being able to work cooperatively with others? And then thirdly, if one does go to Mars, you actually do have to let go. So I think in some respects it's about saying, even if we ask ourselves this challenge of the African city and so on, one of the things that hasn't been touched on today is I still think that the profession is enamored by a particular body of thought or practice which has worked previously, but as Marcus said, the city of the future is something we don't even understand. And I would argue that we're hampered because we're still using the old tropes, the old vocabularies of what urbanism and what architecture is, which is actually making us flounder in terms of creating the city of the future. So I think this speaks to this question of being able to experiment, being open to failure, being open to doing something different. So the last quality that I would take is a sense of curiosity and an openness to new things. But I would take no objects because it's too heavy to get to Mars.
Do we have any takers for the capitalism questions? No, you?
I'm just struck by, firstly I'm delighted to hear McKenna and Paul talking about the inadequacy of the binaries and things. And I'm struck by how these binaries are so pervasive. The notion of the divided city, and even in the BPPU film, there's that date that Cape Town begins in 1652. Who uses that as a notion of beginning anymore? And then it kind of moves on to this sort of notion that there's this, there's this city centre in which we must do social housing, and then there's the sort of sites like you see in the BPU thing. But there are a whole lot of places in between there. The Macassars, the Bonteheuwels, the Bishop Lavises, the Lavender Hills, the Longzamos, the Luandes, the Belhars, the Belleville's, that are absolutely outside of this ambit of this conversation and of the Design Capital 2014. So, the kind of the move to think African as an ethnicizing turn, kind of multicultural city absolutely belies, this is a city of hybridity. This is a city absolutely marked by forced removal. And that forced removal is not just about visiting, sites from Greenpoint to District 6. It's about going to see where people actually move to and actually getting architects and spatial design professionals who come from the places that they certainly don't historically. So, I would say that partly the job of the academy, and training architects, and, one of those questions is to find, actively and aggressively make sure that you find students who are not just coming out of the spaces where mom can afford to design the first building, but also the intellectual project is to actually, this critical project of self-reflection is to actually undermine. The other term that came up in the BPU thing was, I don't know, it's just me, but, the lookout tower. Hello. It's this notion that surveillance is a good thing, using the lookout tower in the form of the, the kind of, the military camp that, we're so kind of good for. So, I'm just wondering if we don't need to really be doing the harder work of thinking and how that might actually just, begin to have some of the kind of shifts that Ian's talking about in the DPU.
Thank you, Noli. I'm going to take one more round of questions before we wrap up the conversation for tonight. Joe? It's on to give Joe a mic.
And Joe was supposed to be with us.
I'm sorry, I got confused. I didn't know what was happening. That's all right. It's actually probably much better sitting here at the back because I can be reflective instead of being blinded by the lights. But no, I think there's a paradox at work here because I've heard a range of views about architecture that range from spatial justice to the design of cities and stuff like that. I mean, for example, space is not just, it's not ethical. The only thing that's ethical is human action. So I can't believe that we're talking about these kinds of things. It seems as if we're not really getting to the point. And my point is that the paradox is that we can't even do what we do well as architects. And now we're moving on to an even more destructive mode, which is to look at the city and to try and come up with proposals to deal with issues in the city. I think it's time for us to reclaim the lost ground of architecture, to understand better what it is that we do as architects and get on with doing that. Then maybe the other issues would fall in place. So it seems to me as if we kind of lose sight of what we're supposed to be doing. We do it badly and then we move on to something new because actually that's probably better to do than do the thing that we're supposed to be doing. If you understand what I mean. So I'm saddened by the conversation that I hear tonight. If I was a student of architecture, I'd be totally confused. I wouldn't know what it was that I would be expected to do as a young architect on graduation. And I think it simply heightens all the confusions that exist in our profession, not only in this country, but internationally. Thank you.
Maybe it's appropriate I come after Joan Weir because I'm not an architect. And I hope I don't throw it into a confusion, but blame Okena, he invited me. I'm an educator and I work with the legacy of the Group Areas Act. So I work with a lot of young people and we've spent the last 10, 15, probably 20 years trying to work with what I call the poverty of imagination. I mean, we had a lot of imagination when we were fighting what was very clear, the apartheid state, and we seem to have just lost it. The point I just want to put to people on the panel is that I don't think it's as complex as we're trying to make it out, and I want to refer to what Andrew Borain said, that we need to move to deepening the description of the problem. It's not just about the tale of two cities, it's how we understand the nature of those two cities. Because I don't think people go deep enough into understanding that. And secondly, I want to just refer to a story of the work I do very shortly. I was in Langa. Now, for those of you who don't know, Langa is divided from Bonteheuwel by a highway. And to solve the problem of the apartheid divide, they built a little bridge across the road. I was standing at the Robert Sobukwe Memorial. It's an amazing memorial. It tells an amazing story about the city. And it's a memory that's constantly been wiped out. It's the memorial surrounded by about 5 different schools. The kids never go there. It's placed right next to a public hub, transport that's more of a drug den, child trafficking, you name it, everything. And just about 50 meters down the road, you have Bonteheuwel. And I stood there with a Colombian intern, an intern who works in education in Colombia. That's in South America, not the University of Columbia. And they deal with very similar legacies, the legacy of historical trauma, drugs, etc. And I stood there and I said, but this is not rocket scientist. This is not rocket science. Where is there an architect? Where is the university faculty that can bring their students, stand here and say, how do we use design to work with the people here to come up with various mechanisms to try and solve this problem? And I think that's part of the problem we're dealing with. It's not about returning to an architecture which is a bit like Gil Scott-Heron's. I mean, we referred to Bob Dylan earlier. I prefer Gil Scott-Heron in his song where he talks about, you know, we can't pay our income tax, blah, 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 and Whitey's on the moon. You know, Whitey's on Mars. How do we solve the problem? And I don't mean it in a racial sense, if those of you understand poetry as metaphorical. You know, how do we deal with real people's problems? How do we use design to actually get people to live in a city that's an African city in the sense that it respects diversity, because Africa isn't one country. So maybe you can just respond to that.
Good evening to everyone. I'm a student and I represent students. I'm interested in change, which seems to be the chief ingredient of this enterprise tonight. And it seems to irritate my mind what I hear right now as a student, and my ear too. Do we really know what change is? That's the first statement, and I have a question after that. Do we know what change is and where it begins? Change begins from within, and then manifests without. But it seems like we still preserve our privileges and our benefits of the past, and they're perpetuated to now. And now we speak about change. I'd like to ask one question. If really we are sincere in change, can we, if we own a house in town somewhere for 4 million, are we ready to move to the township of Khayelitsha and build that 4 million house there? Because that is change, complete change, revolution. We don't only change the way we think, we should change the way we act as well. Are we ready to move to Khayelitsha and build a 4 million house there? That is my question. Do we really know what change is?
We have 4 questions, one behind you and 3 to the side.
Okay, I'm Freedom, I represent Australia. What I'd like to know is, what is the reason we are going all out to design our city? Is it because we want to compete with the international scene and get a good pat on the back, or is it because we want to sort of improve the lives of the people that are living within the city? Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Yukira Chabela, and I have more of a proposal than a question. Do we have space or a place for occupational therapy and art as a form of rehabilitation for young minds that have had to deal with the residual effects of apartheid, because that is starting from grassroots level. In the last 2 years, I've seen a pattern in young people. We tend to hold things in, which is very unhealthy, because it's important that we voice ourselves. It's important that we're able to express ourselves freely in order to bring about change, because it really does come from us. So is there a place for occupational therapy and art therapy to begin to unpack those social ills that we are talking about tonight?
We're going to take 2 more before I close the session.
Hello, my name is Mike Lowe. I was a practicing architect for about 12, 13 years, and I joined UCT a few months ago. So in my case, it's probably something like it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. But people always used to ask me what it means to be an architect, and my response was always that you're a BS filter. You take what the client says and you make it sound sweet to the contractor, and you take what the contractor says and you make it sound sweet to the client. And that's how you get things done. But I've recently decided to modify it from a filter to a conduit. And I think we've heard about effective architects, as Alta said. Gordon spoke about free access to services. We've heard about engagement. Having joined the university, I got involved in a little project and an informal settlement, which is the design and the making of a washing platform. It's a very simple thing, providing basic services and water for people to wash their clothes. And the idea is that the students design it, but that they can go out there and physically build it And just to start out, I'm new in the city, and just phoning people in the private sector, I'm astonished by the uptake of how much people want to get involved and how much people want to contribute. And the students have the option of volunteering to build the platform, and the uptake was also astonishing. So I think as a conduit to leverage the skills and resources on the one hand and direct it to places of need, I think you'd be surprised how many people are keen to contribute and get involved, but they're just looking for a conduit to be able to access it.
Thank you. This actually follows on quite nicely, I think, from what the former speaker had to say. And you know, in many of these events, we take the long view, which obviously is important. We imagine what the city will look like in 2040. But we often forget about the simple interventions that could happen today. I think we often forget the extent of the crisis, of the emergency that currently exists in many informal settlements across the country. I'm from an organization in Khayelitsha called the Social Justice Coalition. And we actually discussed this event during the week. And a couple of people indicated that they were very interested in participating. But as soon as we heard that it was happening at 6 to 8 o'clock in the evening, it just became an impossibility, because you cannot use public transport in Khayelitsha at night. You take the train back home, and the chance of being attacked, robbed, assaulted, raped in many cases is incredibly high. So I guess what I'm trying to say again is to emphasize, you know, looking at what we can do in the short to medium term as a way to look at the long term. We need to start building partnerships and relationships between stakeholders. And what apartheid did to us is it generated enormous antagonism. And what we need to acknowledge is that antagonism still exists today. People living in Khayelitsha still see the state as the enemy. They don't see the state as an entity that is there to support them. They see the state as an entity which is there to come and demolish their homes. And again, this speaks to the issue I think that was raised earlier around informality. And what I would suggest is that we need to find ways to address that informality through small focused projects, be it through designing toilets that work. There are 500,000 people in Cape Town who don't have access to toilet facilities. Finding places, as mentioned, that people can wash clothes safely. Finding ways for people to get to and from taxi ranks safely. These are the things I'd like to see us talking about more.
Well, firstly, just to observe that the audience is more intelligent than the stage, which is how it should be. But if that's the case, we should have had the comfortable seats. But I have to say, I want to somehow link the last comment to the first comment. And I'm trying to be nice. It's getting more difficult. I so disagree with the first comment, and I want to try and say it in a nice way. It sounds right? It sounds right that space is not ethical, that architects should take care of what they are supposed to do and not reach beyond their expertise. Even sounds nice that we shouldn't say things that would confuse younger people. But you know, coming from New Zealand, I'm very aware of what that voice means, that voice that says you could be confusing the young. That really means I don't like what's being said. I would rather something different is said to the young. And my experience, and the last speaker demonstrates that, is that the young have no confusion at all on these issues. And we're in a very interesting moment in time where there is a younger generation that thinks quite differently about all issues. And I want to get back to this ethical question, because again, it sounds right that only humans could be ethical and space cannot. But that assumes that we could think human, think what a human is without thinking space. And actually, all evidence is quite to the contrary, that one of the most important functions of the architect has been to offer a kind of reflection of what humanity might be and what it is to be human. The species, Homo sapien, is more commonly inhuman than human. So human is as it were an aspiration, and ethics is an aspiration. And so I find it interesting that people of my generation and above, the question of raising the ethical is already somewhat, should we be doing it or not? And I think we now have a younger generation for whom this is just not even an issue. All things, including energy, transportation, access, toilets, reading, changing rooms, safety, all these issues are understood by a younger generation to be simply a necessary minimum step for thinking even a small issue of design. I disagree with the kind of opposition between short-term and long-term. I think the city is evolving so fast that we really no longer have a distance between short-term and long-term. I think those issues you identified are actually wonderful ways to think the city of the future. And vice versa, the city of the future will force very practical decisions for today. But just returning to that simple point, I'm very interested listening into the conversation. What is it that I'm hearing that would be similar in every other such room in the world, and most of it? Because you're really talking about the real question of what it means for us to live together, and what it will mean for us to live together today or live together in the future. But it seems to me one of the things that's different in this conversation is exactly that the question of the ethical comes immediately to all voices. And this is, let's say, one of the most obvious legacies of apartheid, because simply you could not voice an aspiration for what the role of the architect might be without taking account of what you consider to be ethical, whether it be that your answer sounds not like a human quality, but a sort of infrastructural obligation. So just a sort of a general observation that the immediacy with which the question of the ethical, the unavoidability of the ethical here is an enormous strength of the discussion, and will likely generate proposals that have a much wider implication than in this local situation. And I want to go back to your point about which I thought was so eloquently said, about how let's use the myth of Africa temporarily, and just observe, of course, that it's a myth from outside and inside, and even those can't be separated. The myth of an African about what Africa is not completely separate from the myth of somebody like myself who's not from Africa. In fact, it involves very complicated fantasies of what the other might be thinking. So in that situation, in that ecology in which the myth of Africa is sort of a myth on both sides, it nevertheless has the capacity to generate new thinking about cities, and that seems to me the most important aspiration. And I mean, I'm just defending my generation. I hope we haven't lost touch with this next generation, which is much more open source. We are moving into an age in which it's not what you have but what you share that counts. And in that sense, the most classical understanding of what an architect is, I think, comes back. And again, this idea of going beyond what you really know. It's the end of architecture at the moment we start reaching beyond the obvious mandate to provide a piece of physical fabric on time, on budget, etc. And just to remind ourselves of Vitruvius's comment that the architect needs to know a little bit about everything and not a lot about any one thing, because our task it is to somehow imagine how these things could cohere together, like the sort of system of systems. And that utterly pathetic, utterly romantic aspiration of the architect seems to me profoundly valuable in this moment of human history. In other words, I think it's a moment of enormous empowerment, or to say the least, to say it another way around, if we don't step up in this moment with eloquence, then we might as well just turn out the lights.